Welcome, everybody. I'm Simon Maxwell. I used to work here. It's really lovely to see so many people in ODI and so many people online to celebrate the thinking and the life of our friend, Jeremy Swift. Sarah Pantuliano is the executive director of ODI. She's in Washington sorting out, Donald Trump, the international financial system, which turns out to be at least as important as being here. So she sends her apologies, but asked me to welcome you all on her behalf. I worked with Jeremy for a long time at IDS, and the work that he did contributed a lot to thinking also at ODI, where we had long-standing work on all the countries he worked in and all the issues he worked on. And I've written my own appreciation of Jeremy, which is on the IDS website, what he taught us about landscapes, about institutions, about social protection, about livelihoods, and many other things, but also his extraordinary hinterland, as we say, his Renaissance garden in Wales, his passion for fishing, and so on. And I'm sure some of that will come up. And there's just one thing I want to share about Jeremy, which is not in my note about him, which was triggered by remembering a plane trip I took once to Scandinavia, and I found myself sitting between two of the UK's foremost rural development experts. And they talked across me the whole time, all the way to Norway, I think it was. And I thought they would talk about the institutions of irrigation, or about social relations of production in villages. Instead, they did what so many development people often do, is they moved from working at the ground level. They talked the whole time about international finance and the bond markets and interest rates and the dollar. And that's something that Jeremy never did. And I think one of the attributes of Jeremy's life and work that is really worth celebrating is that he remained rooted. He really, he worked in places, he knew people in places, he continued to take an interest in those places, and he didn't get drawn up into the ethereal realms of bond markets and interest rates, as so many of us do. And I think that is something that ought to inspire all of us who work in development at ODI, at all the other places where we all work. And it's perhaps one of Jeremy's legacies to us, is to remember that engagement with the real people at the forefront of development. That's my job complete. My role is to welcome you on behalf of Sarah and to hand over to Camilla, who is going to lead this meeting, and will tell you what the rules of engagement are along the way. So thank you, Camilla.
Thank you very much, Simon. And it's very good to be back in ODI, where I started my working life under the mentorship of Stephen Sanford, another great shepherd of younger colleagues. Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to you all, and a particular warm welcome to Martha and Daniel Swift. It's really tremendous to have you here. As you know, we're here in part to celebrate the life and legacy of Jeremy Swift, recognizing the invaluable contributions to pastoral research and advocacy, not only in the Sahel, but also in Iran, Kenya, Mongolia, Wales, and in a whole number of other parts of the world. I had the great pleasure of working with Jeremy first in 1980 in Mali, and subsequently on multiple occasions. And it was always a delight. Jeremy, as you'll know, died last December, and tomorrow there'll be a service of celebration and remembrance in Abergavenny, close to where he lived for the last 35 years. We therefore thought this was an unmissable opportunity to catch people on their way to Wales, particularly like Ibrahim Agyusuf, so that we could both remember Jeremy and also catch up with what's happening in the Sahel, this enormous region in Western Africa, which doesn't get much attention in the UK. And we're very fortunate to have two speakers from Mali who will have the floor before we hear from 6 other people who are working on various aspects of pastoral development and have worked with Jeremy as well. I did want to thank ODI and its director, Sarah Pantuliano, very much for putting on this event at short notice. We hope this time together will enable us to explore some of the political dimensions of pastoralism in Mali and the Sahel today, and examine how land alienation, conflict, climate change, and political instability are affecting pastoral communities across the region. I have an unenviable task, and I will try to keep order, but there's no guarantee. We do want to try and make sure there's sufficient time for questions at the end. So we've got 2 speakers online as well, and a whole lot of participants online who I hope will ask questions. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm not going to give detailed biographies of each speaker, but hope that each will provide a couple of lines about who they are, where they've come from, and how they first got to know Jeremy Swift. So I'm going to start with Ibrahim Agyusuf. Ibrahim, here's the mic.
Bonjour. I'm Ibrahim Agyusuf. I'm Tuareg from Mali. What used to be called the region of Timbuktu. By training, I'm a linguist. Chomsky style in those days. That was ages ago. And I was working in a structure in charge of promoting national languages in Mali in the late 70s and beginning of 80s when I met Jeremy. I think it was 82, beginning of 1982. And shortly after we met, he asked me to join his team. At the time, he was at ILCA, International Livestock Center for Africa, CPA in French in Bamako, which had an office in Bamako. And the team was tasked with the socio-economic study of the Delta for a development structure called ODEM in the region of Mopti. He wanted me to join the team because he said he wanted a contribution to a better understanding of the Tuaregs groups who had been in the Delta since the drought of 1914. And he wanted me, while doing this, to highlight the complementarities between the Delta, that is the flooded area, and the Mema. And already in those years, the complementarities were beginning to be jeopardized, or disrupted, because there had been conflict. There had been a conflict between the Tuareg and the Fulanis in the Debo area, which is the area which has the more Bourgou, which is Echinocloa stagnina, which is sort of a grass which is very rich with, and cattle is very much fond of. So because of that conflict, and also because the Tuareg, many Tuareg, had goats and camels for which the wetlands were not particularly suitable. Many Tuaregs had, they would say, they were pushed out of the wetlands to the hinterland, the northern part of it, and they were beginning to settle there permanently in the area which is called Mema, and also between Lere, which is the main agglomeration between in that part of the country. We had a very good team at Ilka, very good team. People like Selman Assise, Samba Soumari, who are not with us anymore, were left. Magiraga also gone, and Pierre Yernou still fortunately living in southern France. Before I left Ilka, Jeremy asked me to travel with him to the Gourma, that is the inside the bend of the river, to a small community, Imrad Tuareg Imrad community, where Mike Winter wanted to do his one of his students wanted to do his field work. In later in many years after that, everyone that Jeremy met in that world, at least the Tuareg whom I know, remembered him particularly for one thing: his respect for pastoralists, his sense of human dignity. And that's not coming from, I mean, said by those people. The hint is that he was very different from other, let's say, white people, including one geographer who was part of our team and who didn't have a very good sense of humor. And so Abdoulaye Traoré, who was the head of the veterinary services in Tenenkou, one night when he was hosting that geographer, he lost his temperament, the geographer, and started shouting. He said, "Why are you making all this noise?" and so on, because Abdoulaye is always with pastoralists coming from all over that area. And so those men, I heard them whispering between them, said, "This one belongs to the tribe that was here, that left us." Meaning, referring to the colonial period. Mm-hmm. In 2012, my home, was ransacked by a mob in Bamako, and like many Tuaregs and Moors living in Bamako and Kati at that time, I fled to Mauritania, and there I got involved in an endeavor by an association called Association des Victimes de la Répression, réfugiés et victimes de la répression, that was trying to document, all the exactions and crimes that had been committed against the civilian population, during the 1990s, not only by the military, but also by the rebel movements and so on. Jeremy took an interest in that, and he suggested that I be invited to discussions that took place here in 2013 at Chatham House. I can't remember exactly who was, under whose auspices it was, or and so on. Okay, this is so much for Jeremy. I will not. It's yeah, it's moving. So let's. I'll stop there, and talk about the situation in Mali. I will not think well very much on what is happening today and so on, because it's in the, you see it, I think, in the news and the media and so on. It's horrible. It is horrible. The situation in Mali, you must understand that I speak here just as myself. I am not representing I'm not representing the Tuaregs in general. I'm not their spokesperson, let alone the rebel movements or the government of Mali or so. It's just what I'm going to say here is just my views, my personal opinions. The situation today is that the peace process is stalled. It has been stalled for a year now because the government, I think I think the word probably the government withdrew from the agreement that was signed known as the Accord d'Alger, signed in 2015. And it seems that today what prevails is the military option, and the situation is very bleak, and it is the civilian population that is taking the brunt of it. So you have the army, you have Wagner, you have the militia, you have the rebels, you have the so-called Islamists, and then any group, even small ones of bandits and so on, who have the know-how and who are adequately equipped, to do what they want to do. So I will not talk very much about that. Also that the refugee camps in Mauritania are full. There was one main refugee camp in Mauritania at Mberra, and it's full. They had they had finally to allow the population. I mean, all the population that was fleeing from Mali to settle wherever the local communities would accept them. So the same is true in Algeria. Algeria, you don't talk about refugees because I think the Algerian government has never really accepted that. But the town of Tamaset, of course, has grown considerably, and much of its population is that. It's Tuaregs, from the Kidal region and so on. What I would like to say is that agreements signed between the government and the belligerents, be it Islamists or rebels and so on. I don't think that they are enough to bring a sustainable peace. Maybe they are necessary, but they are not enough. For the time being, there isn't even an agreement. Okay, if you want sustainable peace, I think that you will have to it needs some deep thinking about the chronic deficit of trust, because you can't do things for the future without without trust. You'll have to think about this Azawad utopia. I call it utopia because obviously We all know that the borders of African states are not negotiable, are not cannot be modified, and so on. And parts of Mali cannot be separated from the rest of the country, and so on. You'll have to think about the recurrent putsches in countries like Mali. You'll have to think about the so-called jihadists. I mean, the role of Islam and in these areas. You'll have to do more than just mention the inadequate governance of the whole country, but which is presented as bad governance sometimes for only part of the country, and you'll have to understand why is it that politics, religion, violence, all these are used basically are just means towards money. And last but not least, the fact that the integration of all these populations into the market economy or globalization, I don't know what you call it, is pushing or has forced everyone to live above their means, which means, of course, resorting to violence sometimes in order to make ends meet and so on. I think I should stop here and conclude by saying that I don't think that it is really the role of politicians, to do this thinking. They're not equipped for it. They're not interested. They're not interested in it. All the issues I mentioned, I think the people who are trained in and so on, and who are not directly interested in political power, I think that it is they have to contribute. And perhaps today, what is needed, and maybe from places like this, is this thinking about all these things. Perhaps this is even a sort of prerequisite, for reaching agreements that will be signed and so on, so that these agreements are not as short-lived as the ones that we know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Very thoughtful ideas and the importance of a role for deep thinkers, historians, academics, people who understand the situation deeply, being able to make proposals for how to move forward. I'd like now to turn to the man on my right, Cello Kassa, who's a PhD student at NMBU in Norway under the supervision of Tor Benjaminsen, who's going to talk about his PhD research briefly. Let me hand over to you, Cello.
Thank you, Camilla. Okay. Okay, thank you. So, dear distinguished guests, speakers, contributors, and especially Camilla Tulmi, who is a professor and my academic advisor. So I'm very much happy to be between her and you today. And it's really a great pleasure for me to be part of this discussion. And then first, my name is Cello Kassa. I come from Mali, especially Mopti in central Mali. So I'm doing my PhD at the Norwegian University of Life Science in Os. And my research is investigating how land dispossession can contribute to violent radicalism in central Mali. So I'm very grateful to be here to contribute to this discussion and in turn learn from you and listen to you too. So that's my topic, pastoralism, resistance, and rebel governance in the Sahel. So Tor Hervé Benjaminsen is my professor and my first supervisor, including Shai Divon and Camilla, with whom I'm working now in Edinburgh. I'm from a very small village near Mopti, southern part of Mopti, that you can see on the picture in the right. So it's where I was born and grown up, and then got my early education before going to the university. So in the right, you can see a picture where I am also cultivating with farmers. So this is a kind of farm that belongs to a piece of land that have been taken from pastoralists and given to farmers due to the governmental policies in agricultural development. So Central Mali is here in the middle of Mali, and in the right you can see some cows grazing the burgu. So I'm going quickly because of the time. And I'm part of the ERC project financed from 2022 to 7. And it's a ERC advanced grant offered to Tor Hervé. So my project is called Land Response, and we focus on the Sahel, and our true domain is conflict and migration. So we have researchers based in Mali and working in Mali, Nigeria, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire in Ivory Coast. So in the idea of this project is that not climate change, that is the first factor of radicalization in central Mali, but we believe that land dispossession and local policies and bad governance are the root causes. So quickly to present you my provisional findings from the field work. So here is how I collected my data. So I have conducted 27 in-depth interviews with paralegals based in Mopti. So those people have helped me to collect life stories from people who are engaged in armed groups. So I used 7 families, traditional families, that helped me to navigate through the different villages in Mopti. And also I have worked with elected and traditional authorities and local historians. So in total, I have collected 41 biographies. During my process, I have found 33 that I can work with, but the 9 didn't match my research questions. So, but for ethical reasons, all the information and sources are protected because of the situation in Mali. So first I have transcribed all the interviews, which made 1 or 2 pages, and then I have coded all of the stories. So I have coded based on the origin and the ethnicity and the place of birth and occupation and the reason why we have been radicalized. So right now I'm doing the thematic analysis with Camilla near me. And some of the first results that I can show you is that here you can see the different factors that lead pastoralists from zone ex-zone that you can call as dry land, because in central Mali you have dry land, you have also wetland. So many of these people come from the dry land. So the data shows us that some individuals have joined Katiba there because they want to revenge through the death of their families or friends or parents that have been killed by either the army or the militia, local militia. So some individuals also have joined because they want to bring back the idea of Dina, the ideology of the regime based on Islamic Sharia, Islamic law. But some individuals also want to benefit from this conflict and then make money because they have involved in stealing people's cattle and selling them in local markets. But we have also some individuals who want to have free access to pasture land that they have been paying for centuries. And some also have joined because they don't have any place where they can graze. So all the land have been given to farmers. So their animal cannot go for grazing or drinking water or place where they can stay, because the wetland, when it is when it's time to go for transhumance during the winter, the rainy season, so they have to go every one of them. But in the past, they could stay and then they could sustain their families to live. But now their lives are based on these pastoralist activities, but it's no longer possible for them. So they are very, very angry against this policy made by the government. And also state justice, which is said to be corrupt, because all the cases that have been brought there will take 1, 2, 3 or more years without getting any decision. So, but now with Katiba, it's very fast. So they would prefer to go to the Islamic legal justice than going to the state justice. And for the last, those are who joined because they need to protect themselves, because in Central Mali, in some areas, if you are not part of Katiba today, you are targeted by the army, you are targeted by Wagner, Russian group, and you are also targeted by local militia. So as due to the time limit, I want to stop here, and thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Cello. And I thought it'd be good to have some testimony from the here and now from a man from Mopti who's been studying these questions of land and of conflict, which show that the rather simplistic picture around climate change causing conflict was a gross oversimplification of the complex local politics and resource management that exists on the ground. Thank you, Cello. And do come up and find out more when we break at the end of this panel. I'd now like to turn to a series of voices from people who've worked in different times and at different places with Jeremy. And the first person I'd like to turn to is Annabelle Powell. Annabelle, introduce yourself and give us a short piece on the kind of role that Jeremy played, I know particularly when you started off, and how you see the prospects for agro-pastoral development in West Africa today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Camilla. So I'll start off, as Camilla said, with a particularly personal account of how I knew Jeremy and the impact that he had on my life and career, and which I can only say I am entirely indebted to him for the position that I am in at the moment. From the outset of my career, when I would say he gave me what I would call a wild card based on very little, and put me in a position where I was able to finally do a job that I really longed to do and wanted to be involved in, and threw me into this position in a way that was, I'm still very much in awe of, that he had the capacity to do. And he then, so I worked with him on the initiative that he had alongside Ibrahim, the Mali Conflict Resolution Network in 2013, which brought me into contact through Jeremy with Camilla Tullman and IIED, who I was then able to work alongside for some time as well. And finally put me in touch with Brigitte Thébault, who is another great agro-pastoralist, particularly Francophone, but on both sides really, who put me in touch with the organization that I work with now, Acting for Life, which is a French NGO, and I've been working with them for the last, working for them for the last 10 years. I now live in France and have my family out there. So I have to say I am entirely indebted to Jeremy, both professionally and personally. So thank you, Jeremy. On the side, looking at the situation now, if I'm going to keep it very, very brief, and the key elements that I would highlight coming from partners, the NGO that I work with is based in France, based in Paris, but we work directly through local pastoral organizations on the ground across West Africa. We don't have any offices on the ground, so I'm very much feeding back from our local partners, obviously not from myself. I am not a pastoralist, unfortunately. But what we can say at the moment is that, and what is interesting, is that the insecurity that has rocked the Sahel and the coastal countries over the last 5-10 years has had a profound impact on livestock mobility across West Africa. What we can say from this is that mobility is essential. It's still essential. We know for socio-economic reasons why it's essential in West Africa, but it can no longer be done in the same way. It has to change. And what we're hearing from our partners as well is that this is for several reasons. Insecurity in the Sahel has shown over the last 5-10 years, livestock mobility has moved from the Sahel into the north of the coastal countries, and more recently into the middle of the coastal countries because of this insecurity, amongst other reasons. And that has had impacts, obviously, at the local level, but almost more importantly and interestingly, at the national political level. The coastal countries' default reaction to insecurity has been to close borders, which is not necessarily just an element of West African politics. It is a default position. We've seen it in Benin, who's gone even further with a policy of sedentarization through Proser, Togo, and most recently Guinea, with the closing of the borders to transhumance, which has had a direct impact, particularly on livestock mobility coming from Mali. And what the evidence suggests from our partners, particularly in Benin, for example, where this policy of sedentarization has been in place for some time now, is that it is counterproductive. It increases conflict and increases ultimately the price of meat for the local consumers as well. So no one is winning in this situation. And recently, what's been interesting is that a certain narrative or a discussion has emerged from particularly our partners in these contexts. I'm speaking very much about the context between the Sahel and the coastal countries, that mobility has to also change, because we know mobility will continue, whether that be in Mali, in areas in deep insecurity where certain areas are taken over by different groups rather than the state, or whether that be because the coastal countries are closing their borders. Mobility will still continue, but the situation is worse for everyone involved. So for our partners, they've been saying that we need to change as well. It's a reality of the situation. Mobility in itself needs to change. And if that means that we start to use words like control or official mobility, then so be it. We'd rather go down that route ourselves, coming from the pastoralist community, than have borders close, particularly looking at, for example, Côte d'Ivoire or Ghana particularly. And that in itself is something new, and it's something that we need to start talking about in our own discourse, if that's coming from voices from the pastoralist organizations themselves. Mobility will still continue, but not in the same way.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'm Said Hesse. I used to work for ID, and I'm now a senior associate with them, which means it's quite a leisurely life after working for them. So I met Jeremy in 1981 when he took a punt on me. I just finished my MA, and I'd applied for a job through one of the British volunteer organizations called UNIS. Had nothing to do with the UN as we know it. I'm not quite sure now why. And we met at his house in Primrose Hill, and he selected me to join a small team of researchers. There was Camilla there and others in Mali, but also in Niger, to work on pastoral systems and also dryland farming systems and the interaction between them. He promised me that I'd get a camel with a radio on it. And I was naive enough to believe it. That camel never arrived. What I also didn't know was that the work was with ILCA, as Ibrahim mentioned. And ILCA at the time, a lot of their work was focused on the inner Niger Delta, looking at more intensive livestock systems. Whereas Jeremy's research agenda was very different. It was looking at the mobile systems. And I think certainly the leadership in the Mali office was very much focused on sedentarization and looking at feeds and how you can increase productivity through that. Jeremy's interest was much more how do you understand pastoral systems and the logic that their inherent logic that underpins mobility and draws value from environments that are structurally unstable and unpredictable. And that caused a certain amount of tension between us who were young researchers there and the ILCA office in Mali, which, a bit like Annabelle, we were sort of left to deal with, and we were dropped there by Jeremy and left to deal with it. He had this great, and I think it's wonderful, he had this great, he had great confidence in you, and through that you got confidence in yourself. And I think that's something, and like Annabelle, that first job I got, in fact, I'm also hugely indebted to him, and it's why I ended up after a journey at IIED working with Camilla on pastoral issues and others as well. I think when I look back, I was trying to think of, I may be wrong, but I think Jeremy introduced economics into pastoralism, or was one of the early people that thought of economics and didn't just see it in terms of ecology, although ecology was there because he had also an ecological background. And he saw where others saw chaos in the system, he saw innovation and resilience. And where others wanted to sedentarize and modernize, he saw it as very much, these are the institutions and strategies are really powerful methods in order to live in these very hostile environments. And that, I think, in the 70s and in the late 70s and the early 80s and 90s was really important, because a lot of big development organizations, the World Bank, USAID, and others had started to lose faith in pastoralism due to the 73 and 83, 84 droughts, and were withdrawing. And I think Jeremy was a major player, amongst others, that maintained pastoralism on the agenda and brought in so many young researchers sort of into the picture with that. And I think it's it was really important then, and it's even more important now. When I look back again, I remember there was a workshop at IDS where it was called seasonality, which I think was the precursor to what became living with uncertainty. And then later, modern and mobile, valuing variability, and some of these other things. So I think he was very much at the beginning of that process of reframing the debate and reframing the actual narratives. And that is important then and today. There's a lot of the problems, I believe, that we see in the Sahel today, the conflict, is due to decades of inappropriate development. I look back, I did a chat GPT search just to see whether there was any data on how much money had been spent on water development in the pastoral areas since the 1950s. I couldn't get there. That defeated that IA system. But there's probably billions of dollars that have been spent. And why is it today we still have a water problem? It's not lack of money. It's just lack of governance and lack of building on local institutions. I think Jeremy was very much at the forefront of making that argument. So he wrote a paper, I think, I can't remember where, maybe 10, 15 years ago with Severio, talking about it is only when proper development comes and you have thriving, productive pastoral societies in the Sahel, then you will get peace. At the moment, there's a vacuum. So I think in addition to the points that Ibrahim made, I think we need to have meaningful livelihoods for maybe not everybody there, but for a large proportion of them. See, I think one of the things that we, as a development research and development community, we've not done so well is institutionalizing that knowledge that we do have into the education curriculum in particular. So there have been a few initiatives. There was the work by Brigitte Thébault on pastoral training in the Sahel, which was picked up also and adapted to East Africa with a consortium of pastoral civil society organizations, universities and IID. There's the work that IDS did on also giving pastoral trainings. And more recently, there's the work Severio's been doing on the pastoralism MOOC with IID as well. I think that we need to do more of that, because there are a lot of policymakers who don't necessarily wake up in the morning and think, well, how can we trash the pastoral system? They may be acting in good faith, but really don't understand how it is a system that is finely attuned to working with variability, unpredictability, and it has institutions to gain value from that. So from areas which look inherently hostile to the outside eyes, actually does offer huge resources if one knows how to harness them. So I think this is an area which we need to work on, and I think Jeremy played a major role in many of these initiatives, and that we should be certainly focusing more on that going forward.
Thanks very much, Sid. And I think certainly that early work of his in the Adara in northern Mali was a real turning point for a lot of people in terms of recognizing the importance of local knowledge, expertise, and rights. And that instead of kicking people out of national parks, you should recognize the hugely important role they played in creating the ecological systems that were supporting the wildlife that you wanted to protect. I'd now like to see if we can ask Luca Cole, who's online, if he can make his contribution. Luca, if you're there, it would be great to see your face and hear from you.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I just want to appreciate very much the ODI for remembering great thinker, Jeremy Swift. For me, reflection, not only to remember him, but what we can do even into the future around his ideas. Me, I came to know Jeremy Swift when I came to Ideas sometimes back, when Ideas used to offer a special course on the food security for Africa. And I was amazed by his way looking at things. Two things I want to mention about him later on improve my engagement scholarly and in research. And I'm happy seeing Simon Maxwell, I believe those Ian Schoon and Stephen Debro. These are some of the, or even Robert Schomburg. These are people who really emerge in the ideas to becoming a center for real thinking, critical thinking. One of the things I grew up as a child in the cattle camp. I was with my maternal uncle, but I saw how valuable this system of pastoralism. I benefit from it. And then when I went to the school, the university, there was a conflict, and then I came back doing some research, what happened and I was amazed the level of resilience I saw. Then I did my studies even after the Second War in South Sudan. And I was amazed how even the adjustment and the adaptability of the people, pastoralism system of which one of my maternal uncle shifting away from agro-pastoralism to the pastoralism. And I had a very good chance of. Why I'm raising these issues is because Jeremy, his ideas, he revived pastoralism by the time, even in Africa, is being seen as a primitive livelihood system. And in fact, rather than appreciating, two things happened to Jeremy. One, and I think somebody mentioned it, Jeremy approached the pastoralism as a system. And I think it's very important. It's a concept that is very important to understand the complexity and of livelihood of the pastoralism. And for me, because looking at pastoralism as a system, help him to reposition as a very important livelihood. Rather than changing pastoralism, how can we be able to strengthen? And history has shown how pastoralism over time to sustain the resilient across shocks. I just want to really appreciate, and I'm really happy. Remembering Jeremy Swift is remembering good ideas, and it is upon us how can we continue to cherish these ideas. His legacy will continue to shape the way we think. I am from South Sudan. Look up, I'm from South Sudan. As I am talking now, how the conflict affected agro-pastoralism, resulting into a recurrent famine and famine-like condition in South Sudan. And it is a livelihood that managed to sustain the people of South Sudan for a long time and got neglected with the conflict and even after the independence. A great thinker, great scholar. I benefit greatly from Jeremy Swift, and we continue to remember him. And thank you very much.
Luca, thanks so much for giving us that testimony. And it's great to know that a whole new generation of people who've been taught by Jeremy, by Robert Chambers, and by others are now in these leadership roles in your own country. Thank you very much for that. And now I'm going to turn to Ian Scoons, longtime colleague and friend. Ian.
Thank you, Camilla, and lovely to see you, Luca, as well. I first met Jeremy, I think, in the late 1980s, when I was finishing my PhD and beginning to work at IIED with Camilla, indeed. He was my external examiner for my PhD, and he liked it, except some spelling mistakes that I made throughout. Then I joined Jeremy at IDS, where I now work and continue to work 30 years later, and have worked with him until he retired, and indeed since. He was a great inspiration, and in many respects, my work echoes much of the thinking that he started. I want to very briefly talk about the Great Green Wall, the Sahelian Great Green Wall, blue hiss, and why, in many respects, this idea runs against virtually everything Jeremy worked on over many decades. So for those of you who don't know, the Great Green Wall was established in around 2007 and then was revived in 2021 by President Macron and the then Prince Charles at the One Planet Summit in Paris. It involves creating a 15-kilometer wide wall over 8,000 kilometers from Senegal to Djibouti, mostly focused on planting, yes, millions and millions and millions of trees. Its stated aims are to push back the desert, combat climate change, improve farmers' livelihoods, and stop conflict. And at that summit, $19.5 billion were pledged from all the usual suspects. So the narrative around the Great Green Wall is one of disaster, of crisis and degradation in the drylands and the need to save the Sahel. It almost completely ignores pastoralists. At the summit, the AFDB president, Akin Adesina, said this: "The Great Green Wall is a shield against the onslaughts of desertification and degradation. Without the Great Green Wall," he said, "the Sahel region as we know it may disappear." This obviously raised some hackles amongst me and others, and in conversation with Camilla at that time, we decided we'd write a blog. Not that the blog had much impact, but I wrote to Jeremy at the time and asked him what he thought, and he replied, "I've tried not to follow the issue, but failed. It's just too dispiriting." He went on, "I reread my chapter, Desertification, Narratives, Winners and Losers, in the 1996 book, Lie of the Land, and my conclusions are pretty much the same as they were then." Indeed. Indeed, Jeremy's work focused on this, challenging myths around desertification from his contributions from to the 1977 UN Conference on Desertification, right the way through, with that deep knowledge and sensitivity of dryland and pastoral regions that others have talked about. And this is why the Great Green Wall is so dispiriting to all of us who've joined Jeremy in this debate over many decades. In his email reply, he continued, highlighting the politics of all of this. The Great Green Wall provides a useful model to control the countryside. Planting trees is such a virtue signaling activity, he said. It draws attention away from other more important issues. The involvement of rural people, especially pastoralists, is ignored, making real rural development unsuccessful. Well, too right, as he always was. The lesson I learned from Jeremy is that researchers are also political actors. Knowledge and evidence are important, but they're not enough. We must deploy our research findings rigorously and dispassionately, but ally with those whose voices are not heard, which he did right through his career. And so this is why I think for us continuing to work in this field, why Jeremy's legacy is so important and why we must carry it on, challenging those myths and thinking about alternatives.
Thanks very much, Ian. Planting millions of trees seems to be the answer to almost any problem that you can find. In Scotland, we're trying to push back on an awful lot of that, because if you plant trees on peaty soils, you release far more carbon than you sequester by the trees, but nobody seems to take any notice. Anyway, we've now got Alex Taval, I hope, up on screen. Alex, it'd be lovely to see you. Would that you were here in person, but let's hear from you. Over to you.
Thank you, Camilla, and greetings, everybody, and thanks to ODI for organizing this event in honor of our dear friend and mentor, Jeremy Swift. I'm the executive director of the World Peace Foundation, and I first encountered and got to know Jeremy when I was doing my PhD in Darfur, in Sudan, in the 1980s. But I also got to know him because our family home was just on the other side of that 800-year-old, much contested boundary between England and Wales, just outside and I remember going to see him there, and he had an eye for both the biggest and the smallest of frames, with a sort of deep appreciation of what those frames meant. And this was something like a little vignette, literally a vignette, a wonderful joke that he had on the hillside of where he lived, where he hung, as 18th century aristocrats used to do, a vast empty picture frame suspended between the trees, and with a wonderful vista through it. And of course, it was a joke. What was the natural landscape and what was the work of art? And of course, it was both. And it was an insight about looking through the frame and also looking outside the frame, which was something that he practiced and taught. And we thought about livelihoods, about how he understood the livelihoods in a manner that transcended the metrics and the frames of those who sought, whether malign or benign, to impose on pastoral people, and about landscapes. But there's also the other point that he always brought up to me was lineages, and lineages of landscapes too. One of the things that I learned when he came to visit us here in Boston, and we went to see the Boston Public Gardens, the oldest public gardens in North America, at least in colonized North America, was, which I hadn't known, was that the great gardeners of Andalusia were Tuaregs from the desert, because of course every oasis is the most creative, the most intensely gardened landscape. It is entirely created, and of course it makes absolute sense that the gardening traditions of Europe should have as part of their lineage the learning and the practices of the desert peoples. But on the subject of lineages, I think we are all part of his intellectual lineage of thinking about the world and of coming to and approaching these topics with not only his intellectual openness and acuity and readiness to look at the world from the other end of the telescope, as it were, but his astonishing sensibility to people who are among the most knowledgeable, however poor and marginalized they might be. People and sensibility to the needs and potentialities of his students and those who sat at his feet and learned from him. So I'm really gladdened and humbled to be able to make my small contribution to this gathering. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex, and thank you for reminding us of that great picture frame. I'd forgotten that, but it's a lovely joke. I'd now like to turn to our last speaker, who is Saverio Cratley. Saverio, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Camilla. I'm delighted to be sitting at a table with so many people who had the luck of knowing Jeremy for a very long time and working with him. My particular luck was to meet Jeremy when he was already quite advanced in his career, in his professional life, and so had the possibility to be more generous with his time. And he was very generous. Jeremy let me into his world, hosted me in his house, shared his experience and his contacts from the very beginning. And over the years, as he introduced me to his friends and the people he loved, he liked telling a story that had me persistently visiting his office, knocking on his door for weeks, asking him to supervise my MA dissertation until he felt he could no longer send me away. Every time the story was a little bit different, but always beautifully crafted, so much that eventually I started to believe it myself. But I do remember our first planning meeting for that dissertation, and I said something like, I definitely want to work on pastoralism, but as to the topic of my thesis, I am very confused. And he smiled and he looked at me and then said, this is usually a very good sign. Jeremy would put you at ease first as a precondition to let the good thinking flow, but also out of sheer generosity and tact. And I feel so deeply grateful for our long friendship and the friends he left me with. Sorry. Working on improving the understanding of pastoralism in development circles, or even in some scientific circles, is very much like paddling against the flow, or if you like, a drier metaphor, like pushing a loaded cart up a slope. Even in the face of progress, and progress cannot be denied, you cannot take off your hands. You cannot stop pushing. Jeremy understood that, and in the course of his professional life, directed his effort not only to the cart, but only to increasing the number of hands pushing the cart. Today, after 20 and more years of a paradigm change in pastoral development theory, we still cannot take for granted that new, or perhaps even old scholars and technicians have heard about it, even less that they are following its implications and putting it into practice. So instead, the new narratives around climate change, including those now increasingly used in rangeland-based carbon markets, are turning back the clock on the knowledge about pastoralism, on reviving, and the new clause, some of the colonial myths that the scholars like Jeremy had spent their lives to debunk and replace with better grounded knowledge. So my goodbye message is more than ever, we need the hands on the cart. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Saverio. I think that's a very good point on which to turn over to people both in the room and those online to see if you've got questions that you'd like to put to members of the panel, or if you've got particular points or memories yourself that you'd like to share. Can I see within this room if there are people who'd like to come in at this point? Don't be shy. Susanna, let me pass you the mic.
For those of you who don't know me, I think I'm the only person who was both part of Jeremy's family, but also a colleague. So I'm Martha and Daniel's aunt, was married to Jeremy's first wife, Caroline. And he introduced me and my husband, Richard, and we subsequently spent many happy years in Mali together. I think what I'm struck by listening to everything you've all said is he was actually such a revolutionary. And when I first knew Jeremy, I don't think that's a term that I would have, he was quite straight actually in many ways. But his ideas were so far ahead of their time. I think often misunderstood, to be honest. And Ian, your point about, research into issues as important as this have to influence policy. I mean, I was never a very good academic and left academia for the grubby world of policy and politics. But Jeremy had that ability, despite being a revolutionary, to change minds in a very gentle, evidence-based, grounded way. And I think much of what he was forcing all of us to think about is as relevant and timely today as ever. More and more and more people are moving, and more authorities are trying to stop them, and it's going to end badly. Resources are more and more scarce, systems are more and more fragile. Governance is less and less well adapted to the enormous pressures being put on it. And these are all things that Jeremy was teaching in the 70s and 80s. So I think my, many fond memories of Jeremy, but it's his revolutionary zeal combined with that ability to change the minds of decision makers that made him, I mean, it's an overused term, but I think he was genuinely unique in our world, because very few people bridge that divide. What's next? Now that I've broken the ice. Yes, Danish.
Thank you very much. My name is Doris. I'm independent consultant, but at the same time, I'm doing some work for Spark. I know a lot of you know about Spark, and I'm really struck with the way that the testimony for Jeremy. Unfortunately, I never met him, but I met Ian virtually, and I read your book when I was doing my PhD, The Lie of the Land. So really nice to meet you. What struck me, I think what you said about researchers are political actors, and also the fact that Jeremy was somebody who was a forward thinker, and he was what I'm seeing is that he was always challenging some of the myths, long-standing myths that has been how can we say has been directing intervention, like humanitarian development intervention. And as researchers and people from Africa, we are struggling with those myths because the myths around pastoralists, changing the livelihoods of pastoralists, we have to do this, large-scale irrigation farming systems. But I'm just putting to researchers here, I mean, what is it that we can do as researchers to change the minds of decision makers, because there's a lot of push and pull factors, and researchers have fantastic outcomes sometimes, but whose knowledge counts really when it comes to making decisions. And I think this is a message that I'm getting here, that we do a lot of fantastic work. We get excited, we want to, our research, we want to inform, policy, we want to inform development intervention. But sometimes we give up and, we're saying, okay, let it go. There's nothing we can do. So I think this is such a big message for us, that what is it that we can do collectively to push? Because there's a lot of good researchers like Jeremy and a lot of people here who want to make change, and they want to, every day they want to challenge these myths. But these myths keep popping, like, things in your phone, like, oh, they're still persistent. And I think this is so important for us to think about. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I mean, there are these zombie myths that just kind of persist. However much you think you bonk them on the head, up they pop again. And things like Desert Advance is certainly one of those. Does anyone want to pick up on that question? And then I've got one online question to put to Annabelle.
I remember in about 1993, Stephen Sanford, who you mentioned earlier, who worked at ODI, said to us at the workshop discussing the what became the Living with Uncertainty book, it's going to take at least a generation for these ideas to change. It's probably 2 or 3 generations now. Why is that? Because we don't do what Sid was talking about, invest the effort in pushing some of these ideas into within the next generation of professionals who then will come into these systems. That's why they keep popping up on our phone. So I think Sid is absolutely right. These initiatives that really do help reframe these ideas and challenge these narratives is absolutely essential. And I have to say, just a couple of months ago, in northern Kenya, in one of the hottest places I've been running a training course ever, we had 45 masters and PhD students from across the Horn in the Drylands summer school. And it was brilliant. Here were people, aged between, I don't know, mid-20s and mid-30s, working in different fields from across the Horn of Africa, who were all engaging with challenging the standard narratives about pastoralism. That gave me some hope, because quite often I don't have it, and think back to that comment from Stephen all those years ago, thinking it's not going to change just automatically. It's got to change through active intervention.
Thanks, Ian. I've got a number of questions now that have come up on the online audience. One is from Maria Fernandez Jimenez from Colorado, who says, I owe my career to Jeremy's generosity, giving me the opportunity for my first fieldwork in Mongolia in 1993 and serving on my PhD committee, I wouldn't have gotten to Mongolia and spent the last 30 years working there. Gosh, he's got a lot to be responsible for. And collaborating with Mongolian scholars and introduced. A question from her for Severio. Could you say a little more about the way in which carbon markets are reversing our progress on changing the narrative? Do you mean tree planting or something more?
No, I am referring to, hi Maria, I'm referring to rangeland regeneration, so rangeland-based carbon markets. I know that it exists also in Mongolia, and I do not know precisely how it works in Mongolia. It might be better. But the information I'm referring to is the experience in Kenya, especially, in East Africa, growing, where the argument is very much a before and after the cure kind of selling argument, where the before the cure is pastoralism that caused the problem. The cure is some kind of a recooked rotational grazing with some elements of holistic management, so techniques that were already of the colonial administration time with under new name, and the after is the production of carbon credits. So in as much as the expansion, without saying anything about the quality or the value of the carbon market per se, but it is happening, and in as much as the expansion is based on a negative narrative about pastoralism, even if some money arrives to pastoralists, it does arrive at the cost of pastoralists basically admitting that they cannot do their own things by themselves and need help from the outside to manage their own resources.
You pass to Simon. Simon wanted to come in.
Yeah, I work on climate change mainly, so this is a question about climate change. And I remember that chapter in Lie of the Land, Ian, which was brilliant, because what he showed was that people had misread the map, and they said that the desert was advancing towards the coast, and actually the boundary was going backwards and forwards.
It was advancing at 10 kilometers a year, I seem to remember.
And Jeremy completely debunked that, but I'm curious, there hasn't been more discussion about the long term, the trend of climate change here. When I was in this building last week saying that 1.5 is gone, you know, we're well on the road to 2 degrees, and we could talk about the modeling and the methane emissions and so on. So I'm just curious to know from all of you who know the Sahel really well, actually, can we assume that things have not changed completely radically as a result of climate change? Or to put it the other way around, surely climate change is radically going to change the options available for any kind of development, you know, bottom up and participatory or not, in the Sahel. And what are the long-term consequences of climate change, and what do we do about them?
Who'd like to answer that? All I can say is that the rainfall record that I've got for the village that I've been following, rainfall totals are now 40 or 50% higher than they were in the 70s and 80s. So there's more rain, but it comes down with greater intensity and in a shorter period. And so there's a greater risk of soil erosion, and quite a lot of that rain is lost through runoff rather than filtering deep into the soil. Annabelle, can I throw that to you and make this our last contribution, and then I'll turn over to Sada.
Yes, I'll attempt to answer that as best I can. Given the information that we have, I would say that the impact of this variability and the increasing scarcity in certain areas cannot be isolated from the context of those areas as well. So talking about the insecurity and the movement of people and livestock and herds into areas, creating more density around those areas where resources are already scarce, and the impact of that has on conflict, and particularly in areas where we're already talking about deep insecurity. So I think the climate change impact very much, but it can't be isolated from what is also happening around that and how that is, I don't want to use the word weaponized, but used as well. And I take the opportunity just to quickly respond a little bit to your question. earlier, and the importance, I think, that we all see of making the link between the research and what we do as NGOs, for example, on the ground. And we often talk about action research, but really trying to do that. And I know you said about bad development, and that is a very real thing, and really making sure that the work we're doing, for example, as NGOs or organizations, is fed and led by strong, interesting, intelligent, forward-thinking research as well. And that's got to play a part in changing decision makers' ideas as well, from, if we want to use it, from the bottom up as well.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to turn over to ODI Global's director, Sarah. So Sarah, you're speaking from Washington. It's been great to be able to occupy this space in a temporary fashion. We'll move off onto other pastures soon, but it's been great to have this. Thank you very much. Please.
Not at all, Camille. I'm really, really sorry not to be there. Trust me, if I had a choice, I'd rather be there with all of you than having more discussions about how we can make development finance work better here in DC. But I didn't want to miss the opportunity to at least join, remotely and reflecting on the immense legacy that Jeremy leaves behind. I want to thank Simon Maxwell for hosting everyone into the Global on my behalf, and of course you, Camilla, for moderating the discussion, and all the speakers. And I'm sorry I can't be with those who'll be at the memorial tomorrow either. Jeremy was also my PhD examiner, Ian, and just like with you, he also just found quite a few typos and spelling mistakes. I thought I'd checked everything religiously, but he was still able to find, the odd typo here and there. And I remember that conversation at the Viva, with him saying that, you need to be really, really sort of careful about these things. And more importantly, if you want to really work on pastoralism, you need to be more than a political scientist. You need to be an economist. You need to be a botanist. You need to be an anthropologist. You need to be a data scientist. And that really stayed with me in terms of understanding that what I was doing required, the complexity of the issues at stake required us to be able to straddle, many fields of knowledge and expertise. He was very much a mentor from that moment on. We worked together in Sudan when he started doing more work on Sudan, and he became a friend. And he shared a lot of personal advice to me as a young parent, being very concerned about the baby that I had in Sudan. My husband had moved to Tanzania, and because we were both, sort of dealing with very busy professional lives, kept sending this baby back and forth, sort of sharing the parenting. And Jeremy affectionately renamed my son DHL. And to the very last conversation I had with him, he was always asking me about DHL, but really sort of also warning me that DHL needed nurturing and support and constant parenting, and he couldn't just be left to, two busy professionals moving between different environments. But I just want to summarize what I've heard from all of you about the immense contribution to scholarship that Jeremy made. I think throughout his career, Jeremy really shaped the way in which we understand pastoralism, not just as a livelihood, but really as a resilient, adaptive, deeply intelligent system of managing both land and life in some of the world's most challenging environments. He brought to life the complexities of dryland ecologies. He brought to life the strategic choices that pastoralists make every day. He challenged the stereotypes. He offered new lenses through which to see mobility, resource use, and community. I think Jeremy's work didn't just expand academic frontiers, it informed policy. It was practical. It was, geared to real change. It inspired students. I've heard that from all of you. And I think fundamentally, it amplified the voices from pastoral communities that way too often go unheard. So I think Jeremy showed us that understanding begins with listening. And the knowledge, when it's rooted in respect, has the power to transform. So I think tonight we don't just celebrate Jeremy's scholarship. I think we celebrate his humility, we celebrate his insight, we celebrate the deep sense of justice that animated his work. And for me, that was one of the most powerful lessons throughout my work and engagement with Jeremy. Overall, it was a powerful reminder that good research doesn't just describe the world, but it helps change it. So Jeremy, on behalf of all of us here online in London, thank you. Your legacy will continue to shape the work of so many around the world and to inspire new generations for many years to come. And I think we can all join in a big round of applause for Jeremy Swift. Back to you, Camilla.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thanks everybody, our speakers, our two Malian colleagues, all of you, our online audience. My understanding is that we can now break into a more informal session, I think irrigated with something liquid next door, so that we can continue some of this discussion, we can continue to share, but we can also think ourselves about how we take these lessons into our own work, into our own pattern of professional and personal life, and remember the most important principles and values that lay at the heart of Jeremy's life. So thank you very much. I'm delighted you could all come, and I look forward to chatting.
Thank you.